the circumstances that the Koreans doubled down on their East Asian medicine and became even more enthusiastic. And so instead of it dying out, it had a burst of energy, and medicine became the vehicle through which the Koreans were able to assert their own identity as Koreans, as belonging to this ancient or this traditional East Asian culture.
I'm Michael Max, and this is Geological, the podcast that curates East Asian medicine and methods through the power of conversation. I don't know what to call the medicine I practice anymore. At one point, I called it Chinese medicine because that was the foundation that was being taught at school. Then, as I learned something of the methods from Japan and Korea, I found myself calling it Oriental medicine to be more inclusive of the cultures that adopted it and then furthered the development of the medicine of China. The term Oriental went out of style and was replaced with East Asian. While these language rules are important within our profession, the average patient I see finds it confusing if I refer to the medicine we practice as anything other than Chinese medicine. You could wave your finger at them and call them arrogant or racist, but my experience is they're just trying to solve a health problem and, for good reasons, associate acupuncture with China and China with the Orient. It all gets confusing, doesn't it? What you call something and the meaning that you make of it, like dry needling. Patients ask me about this all the time, and when I tell them it's a kind of acupuncture, they give me the same glassy-eyed look that people in China gave me when they asked, in your country, do you treat Chinese people or foreigners? And I would answer, in my country, Chinese people are foreigners. Many in our trade are upset about how acupuncture has been appropriated and rebranded as scientific biomedicine. I know, it's bothered me over the years too, but at the same time, as a profession, we've been pushing for more integration into the conventional medical world, and it would appear that Assur acupuncture has indeed found a firm footing in that domain. The future sure can look different from how you imagined it, can't it? I've got a certificate hanging on my wall that says I'm a qualified diplomate of the National Certification Commission for Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine. My patients can understand that. I'm not sure what to do when I have a certificate from the National Certification Board for Acupuncture and Herbal Medicine. I suspect it's going to take some additional time spent on, air quotes here, patient education. But at least for me, here's the thing. My patients, they don't care about the politics or what is considered politically correct language of the day. They just want to feel better with some acupuncture. So what do I say about the medicine I practice? Because it comes from Asia. But now, on my official accreditation, there's not a whisper of that. It makes me wonder if I have culturally appropriated the medicine I practice by leaving out mention of its roots, or am I trespassing on boundaries by being from an Occidental culture and claiming authority with an aspect of place and culture that my ancestors had nothing to do with? It's bothered me that lately when people ask me about the medicine I practice, my brain goes into a kind of stutter. I'm not sure what to say. I usually just leave it simply as acupuncture. And when they ask or comment about it being Chinese, a simple yes is all I have to say, because it allows me to get to the work of helping them faster without a history lesson or discussion about politically correct language in which they have no interest. The intermingling of cultures can bring about great benefit through the mutual exchange of ideas and commerce. It also can be a one-sided domination, as you would see with colonization. Other times, the troubles wrought by colonization are the catalyst to help a culture find and hold fast to its roots and identity. In this conversation, James Flower shares his perspective on the colonization of Korea by the Japanese in the early part of the last century and how that helped to galvanize Koreans' resolve to hold on to their own culture. One of the ways to resist the colonial influence was to hold fast to the traditional medicine of Korea. This, in part, has influenced the development of acupuncture and herbs and the way traditional medicine has been integrated into modern life. This is a thoughtful take on how Koreans' resistance to colonization helped to strengthen traditional medicine in a moment when all of traditional medicine was under attack in East Asia. Sometimes it's the troubles that bring unexpected benefit. We'll get right into it, right after a few words from the folks who make it possible for you to enjoy Qiological. Qiological conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. You have clinic challenges? Our sponsors have solutions. Have you ever wondered about the fast and AccuFast? Listen in and find out. This month, Mayway Herbs focuses on formulas and resources for women's health. And later in the show, Jane helps you to organize the modern acupuncture practice, and Blue Poppy reminds us that there's no such thing as a small detail. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Qiological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast.
A busy acupuncturist knows that saving time is a big win. Have you heard about AccuFast earth-friendly needles? The fast in AccuFast isn't just marketing, it's what happens once you learn the system. And that takes about 30 minutes to retrain your muscle memory and reorganize your workspace. But after that, you start saving time every single day. This is John Stan, inventor of the AccuFast needling system. At a recent conference, a practitioner told me he used to spend about 6 minutes per patient opening needle packs and inserting needles. With AccuFast, he said, that dropped to 3 minutes. Yep, he was that kind of busy. In his clinic, that added up to an extra hour every day. Just think about that. Enough time to treat another patient, catch up on charting, or simply finish earlier. That's why it's called AccuFast. It's just faster. And with earth-friendly packaging, you're reducing waste at the same time. Less waste, more time. AccuFast, faster for you and lighter on the planet. Visit AccuFastNeedles.com to learn more.
Hi folks, I'm Yvonne Lau, president of Mayway Herbs. During the lovely month of May, we're happily focusing on women's health. You can enjoy new articles and our Chinese Medicine Matters podcast on topics including menopause and perimenopause, optimizing fertility, and how to differentiate between formulas that tonify blood and warm the uterus. We'll also explore more complex presentations, like hyperemesis, with practical, pattern-based insights to support your clinical decision-making. And check out our helpful comparison charts and discussions on Mayway.com to aid in optimal formula selection. This month, clinicians can enjoy special savings on formulas that support blood, fertility, and menstrual health. Since 1969, Mayway Herbs has supported practitioners and their patients with high-quality herbal products and trusted educational resources. So visit Mayway.com to learn more. Have a wonderful spring season, and thanks for supporting real Chinese medicine.
James Flowers, welcome to Qiological.
Michael Max, thank you for having me.
I'm happy to have you here. You're in Korea. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, thanks to the magic of the internet. You're in tomorrow for me.
Yeah, I'm ahead of you.
Yes.
You're in the past.
I'm in the past. Yeah, I'm living in the past. I feel like it a lot these days.
Yeah.
And speaking of the past, one of the things that's bringing us together today is to talk a bit about history. You know, I've got this history series. I often talk to people that were part of making Chinese medicine happen here in the West, say in the sort of 70s and 80s. You're in Korea. You have a background. You've got quite a background, and we'll get into that in a moment. But part of that is history, and a big piece of that is history of Korean medicine. You've got a fantastic article on Hanbang. Was it Hanbang Renaissance for the World?
Hanbang healing, the Eastern medicine renaissance in 1930s Korea.
Yeah. Fascinating look at what was going on in Korea in the early part of last century. Very much paralleled what was going on in China at that time, too. Western medicine was coming in. The governments were increasingly trying to restrict Eastern medicine. But the Koreans had their own way of going about it. I'd like to begin with how you happened to get interested in this particular phase of time and this particular part of the world.
Yeah, so there's a long version of the story and a short version.
We're a podcast. We can do anything we want. Long versions are kind of fun.
So the long version is that I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner from Australia, and then I was happily practicing in my clinic, and I was doing a lot of teaching at Western Sydney University and the Sydney Institute of TCM, and then the problem was that I was not qualified at a university level. So I didn't have a master's, didn't have a PhD, nothing like that. So years went past and the university put a lot of pressure on me to get a PhD. So they offered me a PhD in science, like clinical trials and that stuff, and that doesn't really interest me that much. And at that time, I was a big fan of Volker Scheidt's first book, The Chinese Medicine in Contemporary China. So after hooking up with Volker Scheidt and having many long conversations, I thought that I'd like to follow in his footsteps and do a PhD in history. Even though he's an anthropologist, he's kind of a historian also. So I'm cutting out a lot of in-between bits, but I started doing a master's in history. So I was working on China. So I did a master's on the history of medicine in the Qing dynasty. And then that was all going well. And then after finishing that, so I needed, the next step was to do a PhD, right? So my intention was always to do it on the history of medicine in China. And then due to a number of circumstances and people from Korea getting in my ear and persuading me, and after a trip to Korea for a conference, then people, they persuade me, why not Korea? It's something different. And then I thought, yeah, it's really different because there's hardly anything in our field in English on the history of medicine in Korea. So that sounds good to me.
Okay, well, I hang on a second. I got to unpack this just a little. This is great. It's so funny how our lives turn out. So you're doing medicine, you're teaching medicine, you're at the university, and you're teaching medicine.
Clinical medicine. But just to jump in quickly, because so every time I taught, I was teaching basic TCM theory and introduction to practice and so on, and maybe a bit of acupuncture, a bit of herbal medicine. But they always chose me to teach the history part, and I don't know why they chose me. Maybe they thought it suited me, but so I was teaching history without really understanding much. And so part of that was I thought I'd better get qualified in history and actually become a proper historian rather than just randomly teaching from books.
Yeah. But you were teaching, you didn't have the credentials. They said you need the credentials. And at first you're like, I'm not even interested. But then you do get interested. But here's another thing. And I just know this from having talked with you. I mean, you have a background of Chinese medicine. I mean, basically from the time that you were growing up, you were born into a family that had doctors. Did you learn some of your medicine in your family?
Well, yes and no. So the yes part is that I come from a line of Chinese medicine practitioners, but they're in Singapore. So my maternal uncle on my mother's side, and my great-grandfather on my mother's side were both extremely famous and successful doctors of Chinese medicine in Singapore. The problem with me was that I got taken to Australia when I was 3 after having been born in Singapore. So I grew up in Australia as pretty much an Aussie kid, but always been acutely aware that I have this Chinese medicine in my family. So it was always there and I was always interested. So I never thought it was weird, and I just thought that normal, even though I was in Australia where at that time there were not many Chinese people. So I just thought it natural. But it didn't occur to me that I should become a Chinese medicine doctor. When I was at school, I thought that I would like to be a historian of China. So that was my ambition. But that didn't work out for a number of weird reasons. But I ended up doing Chinese medicine because the main reason was that when I became an adult, I thought that as the oldest son, I thought it's my responsibility to follow the family line. But it's not only that, I actually was very, very in love with Chinese medicine. So it was just exciting and something that I thought. But everyone tried to persuade me against it because they thought that you should take a traditional university route and become a proper academic and not this weird Chinese medicine that is kind of not in the mainstream. So after a lot of pressure to not do Chinese medicine, I decided that I should do Chinese medicine. Then I did. But that's kind of a shortcut to the long story.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Sometimes these things that we resist, like, no, that's not for me. No, I'm not going to do that. I don't think I'm interested. And then the next thing you know, it's your job.
Yeah.
Right? And originally you were thinking as a younger man, history of China, Chinese history. And, in a way you are very much attached to doing that these days. It's weird how our paths crisscross.
Because I was deeply interested in history of China, but I didn't know anything about Korea, but I was interested in the history of China, but then going to Chinese medicine, and then because I was in Chinese medicine, I met a lot of Koreans, and it always puzzled me that why does no one know anything about Korea? It was just a question nagging at the back of my mind, and so eventually I thought, okay, let's find out about Korea, which next to no one knows anything about. Because
yeah, it's weird, the stuff that nags at the back of your mind. It's like so quiet, you can barely hear it, but it's like a pebble in your shoe. It's just always there. Now, you said you were originally going to be doing this work. You really wanted to do China, and then you met some folks from Korea, and you changed your mind. So what was it that they said to you that had you change course?
Oh, so there's another aspect to all of this. The other aspect is that I became so soon after I opened my clinic and I started teaching, I soon became the president of the major Chinese Medicine Association in Australia. And so as the president, I was young and naive, and I thought gung-ho, and I'm going to do everything for Chinese medicine. And then when it came to international meetings, I came across this problem of where do Korea and Japan fit in? And so this is the question that Ted Kapchuk asked in his recent article that he published last year, where do Korea, Japan, and Vietnam fit in? And then in about the year 2010, 2009, or even before that, there were major conflicts between China and Korea, and being a kind of not outside observer but participant in these pretty fiery clashes, I became concerned that we need, what I thought was that we need more voices. We can't just have, everyone knows that we have a Chinese voice in the world of Chinese medicine. Everyone knows we have American voices, Australian voices, but Korean voices at that time were almost unheard of. And I thought, this is kind of unfair. I don't know why I thought that, but I thought that Koreans need a voice. And then it was just a feeling, but that didn't mean that I was going to study Korea. But then the people who persuaded me to come to Korea were saying that they need a voice. And so why not? Because Korea is very much a part of the story of East Asian medicine as a whole. It's very much a part of the story that very few people know about. And that's what I didn't set out to do that when I started studying that, because I was really ignorant and I didn't know what was going on. But
I love it. I mean, that's a great reason to go study something, isn't it? Or just to follow a path. I mean, you're interested, you're curious, you don't know where it's going to go. I mean, that sounds like a good adventure.
Yeah, it was very challenging and very very troubling.
Challenging and troubling.
Yeah, because there are big questions, and then I often doubt. So the conclusions that I came to, I often doubt myself because it seems a bit far-fetched what I came to think. That's part of the article that you read. So the ideas that are in the article, even Koreans are not really sure about what I wrote. I mean, I get a lot of pushback on my ideas.
Which ideas are you getting pushed back on? I mean, there's quite a bit here in the Hanbang healing.
So, for example, in that article that you talked about at the beginning, what I'm saying in the article is that the Koreans in the 1930s did a very successful and very powerful job in reviving East Asian medicine or Eastern medicine, but that goes against the accepted narrative. The accepted narrative is that, because of Japanese colonialism, Korean medicine was almost destroyed and suffered a lot, and it was a terrible time. And basically I'm saying, yeah, colonialism is bad. No one likes colonialism. And then I put a big but, and I say, but because of the circumstances that the Koreans doubled down on their East Asian medicine and became even more enthusiastic. And so instead of it dying out, it had a burst of energy, and that and medicine became the vehicle through which the Koreans were able to assert their own identity as Koreans, as belonging to this ancient or this traditional East Asian culture. And so that's kind of, even in Korea, that's weird for me to say that, but I think I'm right.
So I read this. I've been reading it over the past couple of weeks, actually, because I'll stop and I'll think about it. I'll read a little bit and then ponder on it. I find it I think your hypothesis is fascinating, and I think your perspective, it seems very well researched. I'm not a historian, but just as a layperson, a practitioner, it's almost like a detective story. It's almost like a war resistance story, because you've got the Japanese coming in as colonizers. And like you say, nobody likes to be colonized. You don't like having other people tell you what to do and how to do it and all that. But your hypothesis here that the Koreans, in asserting their own traditional medicine, standing up for it, and using that as kind of a rallying of their identity and using it as resistance against the colonizer, like it was an act of resistance, if I understand correctly what your hypothesis is, that they weren't out necessarily, throwing stones and Molotov cocktails at the Japanese, although maybe they were doing that too. I don't know. I'm not a historian, but one of the ways that they fought back culturally was by holding on to their medicine. I just think that's a fascinating idea. And in turn, people they didn't decide, oh yeah, our medicine's no good, it's old, we need to modernize. It actually was a path toward modernization and resistance at the same time, if I'm following your hypothesis correctly.
I think you are. Do you want me to elaborate on that?
Yes, I do. I'm elaborate, and I'm really curious too. Like, were the Chinese taking any notice of this? Because the Chinese were having their own problems with a new government, the Republican, the Kuomintang at that time, and Western medicine coming in and legislation against Chinese medicine practitioners and the allure of Western medicine. I mean, they were facing a similar, not colonization, but similar challenges to the traditional medicine. So, yeah, jump in anywhere you want.
So there are two parts to what you just said. So the first part is that, yes, so I am trying to argue that the Koreans did embrace Eastern medicine as a tool of kind of resistance. I'm a bit reluctant to use that word, but basically, if you want to summarize it, it's basically that. But I think it's more an assertion of their own Koreanness, and there's a lot of complexity to this story. Of course, Korea being a smaller nation alongside China. So the background is that the Koreans had always admired Chinese medicine doctors. So the thing to know is that in the present day, we think of Korea and China as separate countries, even though they're both Asian and they're both neighbors. But back in the day, the Joseon dynasty and the Qing period, it was more that Koreans believed themselves to be part of that East Asian civilization and not separate from that. And so they drew upon Chinese knowledge. So, for example, the Koreans always drew on Huangdi Neijing as a basic text, as did the Chinese. But what happened was that when the Chinese Empire, the Ming Empire collapsed and got taken over by the Manchu Qing, that then generally the Koreans believed that they were the repository of East Asian civilization because China had fallen to a certain extent. And that was confirmed in the 20th century when China went through this phase in the 90s, especially of scientization, right? So so the second part is you mentioned about China. So what I'm trying to say is that Korea, there's a difference. The difference is that Chinese intellectuals as a whole, not all of them, but most Chinese intellectuals thought that China was weak because we didn't scientize. And also Chinese medicine is backward. And it's one of the problems that we have, and we need to inject some science into this Chinese medicine, and maybe that would work. And that was a big debate that was happening in China, but what I'm saying is that the debate was different in Korea. So what happened in Korea was that the Japanese came in, and maybe some Koreans also agreed that, okay, this East Asian medicine is backward, and we need to become scientific. And then the Japanese then brought in regulations that made the biomedicine doctors, they're the proper doctors, and Eastern medicine doctors, you are kind of doctors, but you are second class. You're a second tier doctors. And so the Japanese thought, oh, in that way the Korean medicine guys will just disappear. But instead of disappearing, the Koreans, the first point is that most Koreans did not go in for this scientization bit. They went for this revival of what they believed to be traditional, and by doing that, they thought they were creating an alternative or the destruction of their old civilization. So it doesn't mean that they wholesalely rejected Western science. They accepted, as a whole, they accepted that Western science is okay, but our stuff is better. And Western science can help us a little bit, but we're going to hold on to Confucianism. We're going to hold on to Buddhism. We're going to hold on to East Asian medicine. And many of the people who may have been court officials in the old establishment, because they lost their jobs in the new modern period where the Japanese were ruling and they brought in scientific bureaucrats. So many of these guys who are old Confucian scholars or officials, they became Korean medicine or Eastern medicine doctors. And because they were highly educated officials, they produced a lot of documents, a lot of writing to say, science is okay, but our stuff is better. So then they explain why their stuff is better. And of course, the first argument was that East Asian medicine is more efficacious. Of course, we believe that. But secondly, that this is important for us as a people, because we're not going to erase or we're not going to extinguish our identity, and we're not just going to become modernized people. So therefore, the modernity that we talk about in Korea is a different type of modernity than the one in China and the one in Japan. Now, you say, did the Chinese know about that? So that's where it gets very tricky and is very problematic for me, because I think it's very difficult for Chinese and Japanese to accept Korean kind of leadership or wisdom because they always think of Korea as kind of an inferior country. One, because Korea was colonized, and being colonized is kind of embarrassing for Korea because Korea didn't think of themselves as this very weak country. Korea was a quite middle-sized, moderately powerful country, but to be colonized was kind of the meaning. So therefore, it was not really de rigueur, not really done to say the Koreans are doing all these things that we're not doing. And so then I argued that many of the things that, for example, so it gets really complex here because there's a revival in the 1930s where the Japanese claimed that they had the revival. So then we have this meridian-style acupuncture that got revived in Japan in the 1930s. But we know that many Koreans claim that this meridian-style acupuncture from Japan, which had inspired some doctors in China at the time. So I'm trying to say that not only me, but many Koreans believe that that style of acupuncture was actually inspired by Salm acupuncture.
When running an acupuncture practice, treating patients is one part of the job, and managing your clinic is the other. That's why I rely on Jane. When I was first starting out, I had no idea about the office management structure I would need to support my acupuncture practice. It was not something taught in school, and let's face it, when I started my practice, life was simpler. Today's patients expect the offices of their healthcare practitioners to be automated, and as practitioners, we demand an office support system that fits our practice like a finely crafted tool, which is exactly what Jane does. Scheduling, charting, automated reminders to patients, payment processing, and even assistance writing clinic notes with AI Scribe are part of the kit. And for me, the peace of mind that comes with knowing that everything is working properly is why I'm delighted to have Jane handle all my office management. See how Jane can help you too by visiting jane.app/demo. Sign up for Jane and use the code QIOLOGICAL to get a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. Very, very much so. Doing a bit of Salm myself these days and having studied some meridian therapy from different Japanese teachers when I was in school, the crossover is quite significant. It was very much a 5-phase thinking and looking at the Sheng and Ke cycles. And, you can see how they're very, very much related.
Yeah, so the Salm had existed for 200 or 300 years. And then 1920s, meridian therapy became popular in Japan, and especially in the 1930s. But if you look at all the Japanese material or Japanese writings, they always say this arose independently and had nothing to do with Korea. It's our own medicine. But the problem for that line of thinking is that during Japanese occupation of Korea, Japan and Korea was part of the Japanese Empire. So officially, Korea was part of Japan. So that meant that Japanese and Koreans traveled freely across between each other's country, between Japan and Korea. And there was a lot of exchange. And the problem is that all of that material, we don't have recent material. So if you try to find recent evidence, it's almost impossible. But if you use common sense, the correlation there must have been some kind of discussions. And we know that Japanese attended meetings in Korea, and we know that Koreans went freely to Japan and hang out with Japanese acupuncturists. We know that because we have evidence that they met, but we don't know what they talked about. But you see what I mean? So that's just...
Yes, I do. It raises the question, who learned what from whom? Like where did these things come from? And I can imagine, too, thinking of Korea and Japan, basically one country at that point, people go freely back and forth. Here's what I know about acupuncturists. Acupuncturists like to get better at what they do. And if they hear of somebody who's got something that's effective, or they hear of something and they just go, that's interesting, I'd like to know more about that, they're going to go and find out. I think this is very much how the medicine has spread through the world anyway. people get interested and they talk to each other and they learn from each other. And where did it come from? Well, it takes a detective to find out.
So, for example, in that article that you talked about, so we have little bits of evidence. So we have evidence from a Japanese official who wrote or made a speech in the 1930s where he said that actually us Japanese, we almost lost our traditional medicine and it almost disappeared. If you remember that piece in the article, or maybe it's in a different article. And then he said, and the reason why we Japanese have had this revival is because the Koreans never gave up. So even though we tried to stamp it out and we did almost stamp it out in Japan, and we tried in Korea, but it was just impossible because Koreans just were so insistent on keeping their medicine. So we just have snippets of solid evidence. And in today's world, people only go on recent evidence, but if 99% of the conversations were never written down, then that becomes a problem for the historian. So that's the reason I say that's the reason I used the word troubling before, because if you can make these kind of conjectures or some kind of speculation, but if you use common sense, it makes common sense that. So the word I try to use is it was a joint project. A joint project means that, as you say, that practitioners just hang out together and talked and learnt from each other. And so we don't need to get bogged down in which country did what. And that's what the problem is in today's most people's thinking. We think of that's Japanese and that's Korean and that's Chinese. And I think we don't need to think in those terms. So that's back to what I was talking about before. That's why I get some pushback in Korea, because I also say to Koreans that you don't need to think about this is only Korean, you know what I mean? I think that we learn from, and I'm sure that Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, and I can throw in Vietnamese and Taiwanese, I think it was all a mix. So I don't want to use the American melting pot, but it's something like that. Everyone learned from each other.
I mean, look, I'm an American, so we like to think of ourselves as a great melting pot. Different cultures come here, different people immigrate here. To some degree, maybe they hold on to aspects of their native cultures and customs, but there's also like a blending that, you know, you're also an American. There's like that melting pot idea. Exactly. And, you know, everybody likes to have the thing that's theirs. In these days, if God forbid you grab something from someone else's culture and you do it in a somewhat inappropriate way, you'll get all kinds of trouble for it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the cultural misappropriation thing is huge right now. As a person who grew up in the United States in the 60s and 70s, I find it curious because, as a kid when I was growing up, learning something about other cultures, learning to eat their food, finding out something about how they believe, that was considered a good thing. It was a good thing to let some of that into your own life. It made your life more rich. It created more understanding in the world. I know we're in a different place these days. And, I can understand why you get some pushback. Look, anytime you're pushing back against an orthodox point of view, you're going to get a little trouble. But often that's where the innovative work comes from. There's something that you said earlier, James, about Korea being a kind of repository for East Asian medicine, whatever we want to call it. And I had some folks on maybe 6 or 7 months ago who had been following this book. There's scrolls in France and there's scrolls in England. It's out of the, is it Mahuang? Not Mahuang.
Mahuang
Maybe Mahuang Huangdui. I can't remember where it's from, but Dunhua. Yeah, that's it. I should remember these things. And there's evidently a book that's been attributed to Zhang Zhongjing called the Wu Zhang Lun.
Yeah.
And there's the scrolls, again, because of, adventurers coming in and taking them back to their own lands. They're in France and they're in England, but they've also traced these same texts to Korea.
Oh, really?
They've been found they were stored and found in Korea. And from Korea, guess where they made their way to?
China?
Japan.
Japan?
Japan.
Yeah.
So there's your Korea-Japan link again.
Yeah, so even the version of, so I might be getting this mixed up, but I think the version of the Huangdi Neijing that we had, there was a bulk of it was missing in China, and then they found it in Korea in the Song dynasty, I think. Did you hear about that?
It's interesting, isn't it? No, I haven't heard that.
Yeah.
But I have heard that Korea is like this repository. It's like a rumor, you know. But I've heard other people say that there are texts that you'll find in Korea that corroborate things that were lost in China.
Sure. So the Koreans were massive collectors of Chinese texts. So the Koreans would go to China and pick up every text they could find. So they go to Beijing and just buy everything at the markets and shops, and so that they had everything. So then they preserved them in Korea. Yeah, that really happened. And then, of course, there was a lot of interaction with Japanese and Korean. They exchanged notes and told each other about these materials and copied the materials, and that's how it worked in pre-modern times. People would carry these materials in their hands and treasure them and hold them in their library.
Of course. I mean, the wonderful thing about this kind of medicine, yes, you can be a doctor and practice it, but also, and again, you mentioned this in the Hanbang Healing for the World, that lay people can learn enough about the medicine to help themselves. Yangsheng practices and basic taking care of, the various things that arise, colds and, injuries and, whatever, digestive issues. You can treat these things yourself. You can read these books. You don't have to be a complete doctor to be able to apply the medicine in a way that's helpful to you and to your family. And it's often been done that way. Look, when I lived in Taiwan, I used to love to go to the bookstores there. And there'd be like these cartoon versions of the Huangdi Neijing or the cartoon version of the Shanghan Lun, which was fun for me because I could practice reading some Chinese at a very elementary level. But for me, it said, look, this is for the people.
Yeah, I could. So if you want me to I can give an example of that. So overall, the Korean medical texts that were written by Koreans they usually put Yangsheng at the forefront. So that was the major emphasis. The major emphasis being that ordinary people can practice this medicine. So of course, in China, that was also the principle, and Taiwan you mentioned, of course, that was. The issue is that in the 20th century and 21st century, much of Chinese medicine became pharmaceuticalized. What I mean is that, the Chinese government is very interested in boosting these companies that sell lots of products like Chongyao or some formula that you can buy. And interestingly, that is not a thing in Korea. So in Korea, you can't go to a shop and buy, for example, you can't just rock up to a shop and buy Liu Hui Di Huang Wan or Sejun Tang. It doesn't exist. It exists, but it is not common. So what is common is that people themselves will go to the market that are everywhere in Korea and buy lots of ginseng and lots of dangui and lots of shudi, huangqi. You can see it everywhere. And of course, that exists in China also. But let me be more specific and say that during the COVID, I came to Korea in 2020 this time. And so what I noticed is that everyone was going crazy, not crazy, but everyone was taking lots of ginseng and lots of herbs like dangui, huangqi, and everything. And then before the vaccine Korea was very late to get the vaccines because Korea thought, we're good, we don't need vaccines, everything's good because it was basically under control. And then the thing was that
that very much parallels your hypothesis that we've got our medicine and we like it and it's good and no thanks, we don't need this new thing. That sounds like an attitude they've had for a while.
Korea came really late, but then when the government decided that, probably you need to get it, and so lots of people got it. But among all the people I know, they were taking lots and lots of herbs from before the vaccine, so that could have mitigate the worries about the side effects. So they had two choices. One, to just go to the local market and buy lots of herbs themselves, or secondly, they would go to their Korean medicine doctor and ask for a prescription to help me before I get the vaccine. But the point I'm making is that even during COVID, so you know that in China and Taiwan that they are very, very fixated on these prescriptions, like formulas, like, you go to a hospital and they'll give you a pre-made prescription. That happened in Taiwan. It happened in China. For example, I forgot the name of the prescription, but Lianhua Qingwen or something like that.
Yeah, there were a number of them, but yeah, I remember one. In fact, I talked to some folks that were living in Beijing during that period of time, and they did a whole book on the formulas that were used.
Yeah, Shirley Ox and
for COVID. Yes, that's right. Shirley and
Guerin, whatever his name. Thomas Guerin.
Thomas, yes, that's right.
Yeah, so and then China sent Lianhua Qingwen to all the overseas Chinese, which was very funny. So I remember I was in the US at that time, and then I was teaching in the US, and my students who were from China, they said, "Oh, we got this Lianhua Qingwen in the post, and the Chinese government said we should take it." And I said, "No, don't take it. It's crazy because you don't take Lianhua Qingwen as a preventative. That's not how it works." But my point is that phenomenon did not exist in Korea. People take medicine according to your individual condition. You don't just take this pre-prescribed. So during COVID, people would just go and mostly get individualized prescriptions. So that's what I'm saying. So that's more in the line of Yangsheng. I could go on a lot more about Yangsheng, but I'm just making that.
It's interesting that in the Korean written books, medicine books, the Yangsheng chapters go up front.
Yeah, they're always up front.
That really tells you something.
Yeah, it's a Yangsheng culture.
And it sounds like by and large, during COVID, people were taking lots of tonic herbs. They were trying to keep themselves built up.
Yeah. So you can't say everyone, but so I can just point out that you're very familiar with China, I know that, but you know that...
A little bit. I spent a few years there.
Yeah, that's familiarity. But there's a certain portion of the population who are cynical about Chinese medicine, who think it's not scientific. You always come across that kind of person in China, but also in Korea, but not so much. It's more, the East Asian medicine is more embedded. So, and the paradox is that in China, the Chinese government is, in its policy and propaganda, is very big on Chinese medicine. And it's the opposite in Korea, because the Korean government never popularizes East Asian medicine. They're kind of embarrassed about it, but they know that it's so popular, and that they know that the people like it so much that they just keep quiet, and they don't suppress it, but they barely fund it, but they kind of turn a blind eye. But if you're in Korea, you'll see every single street Korean medicine clinics, or every shopping center and big modern malls would be just multiple Korean medicine clinics. So it's just very much in your face, embedded in the culture, which is something kind of different to China, because in China, the Chinese medicine is mostly in hospitals. But in Korea, it's mostly 90% is just your Michael Max type clinic, you know what I mean?
Individual practitioners. Although my understanding, look, I've not been to Korea, but I've had a little conversation with some doctors from Korea as I've been studying Sa'am acupuncture. And it sounds like Korean medicine and Western medicine is very much blended together over there. Maybe I've got it wrong. It's blended together, but the difference is, how do I say this? The difference is it's the patient that gets to choose. The patient says, I want this or I want that. It's more person-centered than like the system saying you should use this or you should use that.
Okay, so of course it's person-centered. It's totally up to you. But the blended together part, I need to let people know that it's really different to China in Korea. The difference is that in China you have what we call 中西结合 or integrated medicine. That's not a thing in Korea. The reason is that according to legislation, Korean medicine is totally separate from biomedicine. So for example, biomedicine doctors are not allowed to practice acupuncture and not allowed to prescribe herbs, right? So I know in the US that doctors can do acupuncture like dry needling, but in Korea it's illegal. They can't do it. And conversely, Korean medicine doctors are not allowed to prescribe Western medicine or give Western medicine advice. So that makes it different to China. So when your protagonist who said that it's blended, I think what they mean is that the Korean medicine doctors are familiar with biomedicine and they learn, just like in the United States, people learn all the biomedicine. I think that's what they mean. But they don't practice together at all. They don't even talk to each other.
My goodness. Okay. So it's quite likely that I just misunderstood what I was being told, or...
So this is what I'm talking about. So a lot of Koreans are anxious to present to the outside world. They think that, I don't know your particular case, but many Koreans think that we need to show we're modernized. We need to show that we know all the modern stuff. So there's that element of people in Korea, and then you have the other element of people who are totally traditional and not interested in Western medicine. So probably the majority of Korean medicine doctors are very comfortable with people taking Western medicine, but they are mostly interested in the traditional kind of remedies and Yangsheng and stuff like that.
Wow. I'm just going to let that sink in for a moment. That's...
So and there's one, I know you didn't ask me, but I'm going to jump in. There's one thing I like to say about Korea is that, you know how in the West that there's that section of practitioners who say, oh, Chinese medicine lost all the spiritual stuff in the 90s because of the communists. So it's that narrative, right? And then therefore we need to, so there are two different groups. One group says, oh, we need to stick to the classics. Let's just read the classics and just go like that. And then there's the other group who just say we totally reject biomedicine and we want to get into, say, Japanese methodology, which is more sensitive and more understanding of the individual patient. My comment about Korea is that, so in Korea, in the medicine that's practiced, you mentioned that the emphasis is on Yangsheng, but secondly, more than Japan, more than China, the practitioners are always thinking about the Shen, the mind. So that is always up front. So you know what I mean? I'm not saying it's like J.R. Worsley and it's totally like the emotions only, but the emphasis is always on the emphasis is always on the emotions of the patient, and it is always on the spirit of the Shen, and that is the thing that many people in the West complained that we lost in Chinese medicine, but that never got really taken out in Korea, all that kind of attention to spiritual aspects. So there are many practitioners who talk about Buddhist spirits, and many practitioners who talk about Taoist spirits, and many practitioners who talk about your mind. And I think you in your program once, Li Zhonghuan, the Psalm acupuncturist, the mind acupuncturist, did I remember?
Yes. Yeah,
so there's one example for you. So he's advertising himself as a mind acupuncture guy, right? So this is just one example of, so this is not something that is, so he's presenting himself to the Western world as this kind of thing. But that is kind of normal in Korea. That's what I'm saying. And it always has been normal. It's never been stripped out. So if you, in China, you presented yourself as a mind acupuncturist, it's not that crazy, but it's not that common for someone to go around saying, I'm a mind acupuncturist. But that's what I'm just trying to explain that.
So in Korea, that distinction between mind and body or psychology and physiology, that they had much more in China. In Korea, that distinction never got made. They always had the mind and the spirit and the emotions and the body all as one thing, which of course it is completely entangled in as one thing.
I'm not overstating it, but I'm just saying that this anxiety about all the traditional stuff being taken out, it didn't happen in Korea. The obvious reason is that Korea didn't have a cultural revolution. And then you can also argue Japan also did not have a cultural revolution, but the problem with Japan is that Japan went full modern in the 19th century. It went ultra modern, and it became almost just like a Western country. But that never happened in Korea. So that's why the Japanese considered Koreans backward, because when the Japanese colonized Korea, they said, "What the hell, you guys are like living in the 17th century still." And the Koreans say, "Hell yeah, we are. We're still."
Hell yeah, we are. In fact, it's very nice. Would you like to join us?
Yeah.
And in fact, again, coming back to your hypothesis, that was what they used to help resist the Japanese. They doubled down on, well, we're Korean and we do these people like us do things like this. We're Koreans and we use this kind of medicine. And we use this kind of medicine in this way because we're Korean.
Yeah. And we're not only we're Korean meant something. It meant that we are very much a part of this, the Chinese civilization, this Sinographic world. We're part of that civilization. But since you guys forgot what it is to be East Asian, we're going to remind you. Basically, that's what these guys in the 1920s and 1930s were saying. So you guys have forgotten who you are, so let us remind you.
Ooh, James, that is a powerful message. That's a powerful stance. I get chills just listening to you say that.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. If I say that, even Koreans think I'm crazy, but I think that's what really happened. Yeah.
How do you see that influence continuing to unfold in Korea at this moment?
Yeah, so it's very different now. So the 2020s is not the 1920s. So a century later, so Korea went through its what am I saying? It went through late modernity in the 1970s, 1980s. So then the problem is Korea modernized very late, right? So then Korea now is ultra modern. It's really modern. So if you came to Seoul, it's like a 21st century modern city. And it's highly industrialized. The issue is that there's the obvious Korea that all the tourists, so Korea is a modern place that tourists come. But underlying all that is that these kind of ideas still exist. So even though in school people learn science, physics, chemistry, math, all of that, and that's all good. But underlying all that is that the theories of yin-yang, the theories of wuxing, these theories are still relevant and kind of gaining a boost in popularity in popular culture. So in popular culture, for example, you might have heard this K-pop Demon Hunters that won all the prizes for the best movie, or probably you don't follow popular culture. But anyway, if you don't follow popular culture, some of your audience will know.
I don't follow much, but go ahead with the example because it sounds like there is something here.
The example was that last year there was a movie called K-pop Demon Hunters, and so in this movie it's animated. So what happens is that these 4 young women, they are chasing demons, and they're helping someone who's possessed through a demon, and in the course of that, they go to get acupuncture, they get Korean herbs, they go for a Korean massage, toina, so the whole lot. So the whole message of the movie is that it's a big, bad, evil world out there, and we still believe in demons. But if you follow the path of yin-yang, follow the path of compassion, follow the path of being virtuous and getting acupuncture and all that, everything will be good. That's the message of the story. So basically that last week it won lots of prizes in the American Golden Globes or whatever. I'm not really sure, but it won lots of prizes. So
okay, I should probably go see it. Yeah, you've got my interest now.
It's for young people, but but that's the message of the story.
Well, James, it sounds like there's a cultural message in here. It sounds like there's an aspect of the culture. Culture always speaks out through its youth in new and interesting ways. And it's fascinating to hear, that we got this modern world and we got all these troubles. There's still demons and you still need some acupuncture and some herbs are going to help you. And that's fascinating.
And then from that movie, there's a big upsurge in popularity in youth culture of East Asian medicine. So now acupuncture is a youth sensation, a cultural kind of revival.
Wow. Acupuncture is more of a sensation because of that film.
But that film was made because there's an undercurrent of how popular it is amongst the people. So that if no one liked it, no one would make the movie, right? So what I'm saying is that we have this ultra-modern... So what it is that the West, right? The West, when it became scientific in the late 19th, early 20th century, the West decided that we're going to scrap all the old stuff. Let's forget about Galen, let's forget about Hippocrates, and let's forget about Plato and all these guys. So we're just going to go with Einstein and Isaac Newton, right? But what I'm saying is that in East Asia, and particularly Korea, that, okay, we've got all this science, but we're keeping the old stuff too. So basically, that's the overall message that I'm trying to get across. So that if you talk to a Korean, they'll tell you about, oh, we're scientific and we've got all this stuff, but underneath all that, there's a different world that they don't present to the outside world. And that might be because they're embarrassed or they think that this is not really modern. But with this movie, K-pop Demon Hunters is a kind of breakthrough for this kind of embarrassment. So, oh yeah, it's cool to get acupuncture, and it's not crazy that you believe there are demons and that we can fight demons through compassion and things like that. Anyways, so where do we go from here? I'm not really sure.
In clinic, there's no such thing as a small detail. The needle you reach for, the formula you prescribe, the moment you choose to listen just a little bit longer. Your patients place their trust in you, and you deserve to place the same trust in the tools that you use. At Blue Poppy, they hold their products to the same standard that you hold your care. Herbal formulas crafted for efficiency, needles that perform the way you expect them to, clinic essentials that arrive on time. Because when your tools are dependable, your focus stays where it belongs, on your patients. No guesswork, no compromises, just steady support behind the scenes. Blue Poppy, the choice of practitioners since 1982. Again, I'm just kind of, and I'm not an anthropologist and I'm not a historian. I'm just an acupuncturist.
But no one's just acupuncturist. You're a man of much knowledge.
But, I'm thinking about your hypothesis here again. And, you can think of so the Japanese, they're colonizing politically and culturally and to some degree with Western science. So in some ways, when you think about it, and maybe I'm using this out of context, but science, Western medicine in particular, in a way has colonized the entire world.
Yeah.
I mean, beyond politics, that medicine and the corporations that run it have colonized the world.
Yeah, you said it. It didn't have to be. It didn't have to be. But that's a choice that the world took.
Yes, and the Koreans pushed back by doubling down on their traditional culture. And in some ways, I think we could even make a case, maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but I do that anyway, that back in the 70s and 80s, there were some young Americans that were pushing back against that same modernizing force. And they found this thing called acupuncture and East Asian medicine. And they pushed back by learning that stuff and practicing it.
Yeah, that's what your previous guests talked about, like Volker Scheiss and then Dan Bensky and a whole bunch of people like that. And Volker talking about his being a kind of a hippie child or something like this.
Yes.
But
From
there's another thing to say though is that because the 70s and 80s acupuncture and Chinese medicine got rebranded as this new thing, but the thing to know is that it wasn't really new even in the West, because not many people know that acupuncture was actually quite popular in the West in the 19th century. So, for example, do you know the textbook that Western medicine doctors use it used to be, or still is, Harrison's Principles and Practice of Medicine. Anyway, that's the basic textbook in the United States. But in the first several editions in the late 19th century, there were chapters on acupuncture. And it was practiced in hospitals like Johns Hopkins, and so people did not think it was weird.
In the United States.
Yeah.
This was.
Yeah, yes. And these were white American guys practicing acupuncture. But the acupuncture they were practicing, it could be argued that they didn't really know the theory that well, and that's probably true. They didn't really down on yin yang and wu xing and Psalm and all these theories, but they knew that acupuncture worked, right? And so it was not weird and it was not unusual. What happens in the 20th century is that we forgot that, and we just forgot. But the records are all still there. You can just go and look it up in the libraries and you'll see that acupuncture was in the textbooks. And then that
is mind-blowing. And I get it. Look, maybe you don't even need to understand it in completely traditional terms to use it effectively, but just the fact that it was in the medical manual of that moment in time is really quite remarkable.
The founder of Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, William Osler, he was a big acupuncture man. The big break happened in the 1910s, in 1913, when in 1913 the biomedicine profession basically took over. When you say colonized, they decided that we're the medicine, and they didn't disparage acupuncture. They just kind of forgot it. They didn't look down, but they moved on. But in the 19th century, it was not really certain that biomedicine was going to be the medicine, because there were a whole bunch of other medicines like homeopathy and herbal medicine, and everything was going on. But the 20th century was the big thing. And then we got bureaucracies, and because the United States became bureaucratized in the progressive era, and after that, and then the insurance companies came in, and then that was it. And then in the 90s, we had the New Deal, and so the idea was that governments should run everything, and when governments started to run everything, then, the governments made a choice. Let's just do biomedicine, Western medicine, and they forgot about all the other stuff. So in the 60s and 70s, when people like the young Volker Scheidel, those people, they decided they're kind of going to rebel against this world that in which science dominated, that, they're not doing something new, but they're repackaging. So the repackaging is new, and the meaning is different. So then in the 70s and 80s, it became a political statement that I'm different, and I'm not, I'm going to be a macrobiotic guy, and I'm going to eat seaweed, and I'm not going to just be a white bread American or something like that. And so sure, it's lifestyle revolution, but of course it's drawing on the East. But people like William Osler in the 19th century, they didn't care about whether it was from China or where it was from. They didn't care. They just thought, this acupuncture thing works, and let's get some needles. And so they did lots of lower backs, because they found that when you do acupuncture on lower backs, that, they get better. How about that? They weren't really bothered about how it worked. But in the 20th century, because science became such an industry, that then you brought in things like clinical trials, and we need evidence, and you can't just say that works. And so that's when medicine changed, when you had this idea that you need clinical trials, you need double-blind And so that kind of screwed everything for acupuncture because it's difficult to do double blind for acupuncture. So it's kind of just...
I would say it's impossible. It's impossible. You can't. But I've got some friends that are researchers these days, and evidently there's new models that look at complexity, and there's different kinds of studies that you can do, looking more at comparing, say, the whatever the gold standard is, whatever the clinical gold standard is against whatever you want to test it on. And, like try this medication versus try some acupuncture, and then just look at the results. Right? You don't need a double-blind study for that. You just need to compare the two groups and see how did Group A do compared to Group B. There are ways of getting kind of science-y on it, but there's all, there is that scientific paradigm, and it's so easy to be inculcated and hypnotized by it. It's very useful. I think the scientific paradigm is very useful. The whole idea of observing nature and coming up with an idea and testing your idea and observing to see what happens. Oh, wait a minute. That sounds like an acupuncture treatment now that I think about it.
But your questions before about cultural shifts, cultural shifts are decisive because your friends who work in science, in acupuncture, they could probably tell you that. So someone like those people, they will tell you, oh, we've done multiple trials and we have lots of publications, but yeah. So there are multiple journals where they pump out these successful clinical trials showing how great acupuncture is. But the issue is political and cultural because the big scientific guys in the United States in the hospitals, they're not aware, or they don't have time, and they might have read a couple, or they're aware of that. They don't look down on those trials, but change doesn't really happen until it becomes a cultural consciousness that, because the trials is not the thing. People don't read clinical trials, and scientists who are biomedicine professors, they say, yeah, good, so what? I'm busy, I have my own job, and I'm going to keep pumping out my own clinical trials. And until you have this cultural shift, it's not, what I'm saying is the clinical trials are not decisive. That's not the decisive factor is cultural shifts.
It's the cultural consciousness, which brings us back to the K-pop demon hunters. And it brings us back to your hypothesis that it was the cultural spirit of that time in last century during the colonization of Korea that helped Korea to weather that particular storm. It came from the culture.
And yeah, and that cultural spirit, what I would argue, but I don't have much evidence, is that because of that, the Japan and China then were able to ride on the back of that Korean Renaissance in medicine, because the Renaissance is a misnomer, because actually the medicine never got into much difficulty and never was threatened in Korea, where it was threatened in China. Definitely was threatened in Japan and Taiwan, where it almost disappeared. And in China, it could have disappeared, but in Korea it was never going to disappear. So I'm saying that even if the Chinese guys at that time didn't write about it and Japanese didn't write about that, there must be some kind of, because we always talk about qi, so there must be some kind of consciousness going on that, shit, these Korean guys are still so stubborn, they're still insisting on getting acupuncture, and let's look at this example. But yeah, you just don't see people writing about that. That's where I find it difficult to be really sure. But I would guess.
Well, here's a question I had too. I don't know if this will clarify things or make it muddier, but Kampo, the characters for Kampo are Hanfang, right? Han Dynasty, the Han, Fang, like prescription Fang, Hanfang, right? Okay. And then I was reading your article, Hanbang, and you were kind enough to include the Chinese characters, which I could read. It says Hanfang, which in Japanese is Kampo. So you could almost say Kampo healing for the world if you were speaking Japanese.
Sure.
How is it these two things have the same name?
Oh, so there you get into one of my difficult problems, because generally everyone, in all the articles I read, they said that Hanbang means Chinese formulas. So if you read all the historians, 90, I think everyone says, oh, this means Chinese formulas. So Kampo translated as Chinese formulas. But in Korea, I think that's totally not true. It doesn't mean Chinese formulas. So the Han does not mean, the Han is referring to the Han River. So in Seoul, there's a river called the Han River. Yeah, at least the main river.
Same character?
Yeah. And
Oh, it's that character.
yeah, and the character does not mean,
Okay.
it doesn't mean Chinese. It means great or flourishing or this great medicine. So in the article, I say that it's a polysemic word. So polysemic means that it has multiple meanings. So, but I think the original meaning is, in Korean cases, that is referring to this Korean river, which is a wonderful river and it's great. But we also can be referring to the Han Dynasty. But it could be that, but then Koreans never said, this is because it's Chinese. They didn't say that. They just say this is Han Fang. But if you look at all the literature, the materials, the word kampo is a new word in Japan. It existed in the 19th century. It existed earlier, but it was very rarely used. It only became popularly used in the 1900s and then more so in the 1930s. Before that, they referred to it as Eastern medicine, usually just medicine or Eastern medicine. So this is another one of these things where you speculate. I think that Hanbang came first and then Kampo came from there. So I think that probably the Japanese, they saw that Koreans like using this word Hanbang. And then some guy said, oh, we'll just translate that into Japanese Kampo, and then it became popularized, and I think that it went from there. But again, that's speculation, but I still think it's true that Hanbang came before Kampo.
Okay. All right.
So I think it's...
That's helpful to know. Again, I looked at those and I thought, oh, these look the same. I didn't...
No, it's the same.
It is the same, but there's a different context for what Hanfang means.
So words mean something different when they go to a different location or a different...
Okay. All right, that makes sense. Cool. So James, what are you working on now? What's your
What we're just talking about, your article that...
Yeah,
So that article that you're talking about at the beginning, so that's part of one book. So I have a book that is supposed to be coming out soon. I'm almost finishing up. It's on exactly this topic of Korea in the 1920s and 30s. So there'll be more. I'm fleshing out all the things that we just discussed today. Yeah.
Great. Any idea when that'll be coming out? It's always a terrible thing to ask a writer. When do I get to read it?
Or maybe... So I'm supposed to submit it early this year, so I guess that I still need to do revisions, and then the publishers will take some time, so perhaps late this year, early next year. I'm being optimistic, but yeah.
Great. I'm going to look forward to reading that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. James, thank you so much for this conversation today.
Thank you.
The medicine is interesting. The way that it moves through the world is fascinating. And your point about what happens when it actually takes root in a culture. I think once it's rooted into a culture, you can't stamp it out. It's just it's just part of who people are. It's not just their identity, it's their habits, it's the way they communicate with each other.
Yeah.
And apparently acupuncture is making a bit of a comeback in the world these days.
Yeah. So in the United States, there are pessimists and optimists, right? So I think you're on the optimist side.
I tend in general to be optimistic.
Yeah.
It gets me in a lot of trouble because sometimes optimism is not warranted, but I do tend to be optimistic. And as far as acupuncture is concerned, about a year ago, I had somebody on the podcast, president of one of the universities or acupuncture colleges, and he said, acupuncture in the United States is doing great.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Acupuncturists are not doing so great.
Yeah.
But acupuncture, in terms of its penetration into the medical system, look, there's dry needling. The physiotherapists have a thing that they call the Graston technique. It's basically gua sha. So the methods of this East Asian medicine are very much making inroads into the Western culture here in the United States. Very, very much so. But physiotherapists are using it, doctors are using it, different kinds of people, not necessarily acupuncturists. So the medicine is doing fine. Who practices the medicine? That one's still up for grabs.
You said it.
It'll be interesting. All right.
All right.
James, thank you so much for your time today. This has really been fun.
Thank you, Michael. Fun for me too.
Until next time.
Okay. Take care, man.
Well, that does it for today's conversation with James. One of the things that got my attention in this conversation is not just the history, though the history is plenty interesting. It's the way the medicine ends up carrying more than medicine. It carries memory, identity, a way people remember who they are, especially when up against an influence that would like to wipe that away. James came to Korean medicine history by a circuitous path, which always makes for an interesting route to travel. Family lineage, clinical work, teaching along with a push toward academic credentials, and an interest in China that oddly kept getting turned toward Korea. And once he started looking there, he found a story that didn't fit the usual narrative. Yes, colonialism is brutal. I mean, after all, when's it not? And yes, just like in China, at the same time, there were efforts to sideline and diminish traditional medicine. But what he sees is that in Korea, that pressure, it didn't extinguish the medicine. It seems to have made people hold it even closer. What I kept thinking about is how this medicine stayed close to the ground in Korea. Not just in clinics, but in ordinary life. In the books James was talking about, Yangsheng was a key element, which tells you something right there, that it's not only medicine for experts. It's medicine that assumes people can be able to care for themselves and their families. And I was also struck by his point that in Korea, the mind never seems to have gotten split off from the body in quite the same way. That seems important, especially now when so much of modern life asks us to live from the neck up. Korea is as modern as anywhere, but under that speed and polish, there still seems to be another operating system running. Old ideas, older habits of perception, a different sense of what it means to be a person in a body. And then I also get to thinking about how East Asian medicine has found its way through the centuries down to us. Maybe medicine survives when it lives in people, not just institutions. Once it takes root in habits, kitchens, clinic, language, and imagination, it gets a whole lot harder to erase. And as we are at this moment of time here in the West, facing some very big challenges to our medicine, this is particularly something important for us to remember.